My daughter became a millionaire by publishing a book about my deepest, most agonizing pain. But in every national interview, she claimed I was too stupid to even read a single page of her masterpiece. She sat on those velvet chairs in late-night talk shows, laughing about her uneducated blue-collar father, who barely knew how to use a computer, while the audience chuckled along. What she didn't realize was that I had already written the final chapter for her, a chapter that would dismantle her gilded world piece by piece, leaving her with nothing but the ink on her lying hands. For 40 years, I've been Jack, the guy you call when your foundation is cracking or your roof is sagging. My hands are mapped with scars, and my fingernails are permanently stained with the dust of cedar and pine. To my wife Martha and my daughter Emma, I was just a walking paycheck in a grease-stained flannel shirt. They saw the old pickup truck in the driveway as an eyesore, and they saw me as a relic of a world they were too, quote, to belong to. But they never knew about the locked wooden chest hidden under a pile of rusted saws in my workshop. That chest held my life, not in blueprints, but in words. Writing was my survival. When we lost my young son, Leo, to a sudden illness 20 years ago, the world turned gray. I couldn't talk to Martha. She had turned her grief into a cold, hard shell of social climbing. So I talked to my journals. I wrote about the smell of Leo's favorite blanket, the crushing weight of the silence in his bedroom, and the raw, ugly reality of a man trying to hold a crumbling house together while his heart was in ashes. I poured every ounce of my soul into those pages, thinking they were my only true companions. I thought my secrets were safe behind a brass padlock, buried where no one would ever care to look. I was wrong. My daughter didn't just find my soul. She decided to sell it to the highest bidder. It happened on a Tuesday. I was at the local bookstore, looking for a manual on vintage engine repair, when I saw her face. Emma. My daughter was staring at me from a massive cardboard display near the entrance. The title of the book was The Weight of Silent Dust. The cover was elegant, expensive, and sophisticated. The blurb called it, quote, 3 and a quote 4. I felt a swell of pride so thick I could barely breathe. My little girl, the one I'd put through Columbia University by working double shifts in the freezing rain, had actually done it. She was a novelist. I bought a copy, my hands trembling. I didn't even wait to get home. I sat in my old truck, the engine still ticking as it cooled, and opened the first page. My heart stopped. The first sentence wasn't just familiar. It was mine. It was a description I had written 10 years ago about the way the light hits a child's empty shoes in the morning. I flipped to the middle, then the end. Every metaphor, every private thought I'd ever had about the loss of my son, every secret observation about my failing marriage, it was all there. She hadn't just used my life for inspiration. She had transcribed my journals, word for word. I sat there in the silence of the parking lot, clutching the book until my knuckles turned white. She hadn't even changed the names of the streets or the descriptions of the weather. It was a total violation. It felt like someone had broken into my chest and stolen my actual heart to put it on a shelf for sale. I thought back to all those nights she'd spent, quote, 5 in my workshop while I was out on late calls. I thought about how she used to ask me where I kept the spare keys to the equipment lockers. She wasn't looking for tools. She was hunting for content. And the worst part was the dedication page. It didn't say, quote, 6. It said, quote, 7. She was calling me voiceless while using my voice to become a star. The realization that my own daughter had pillaged my soul for profit was a bitter pill to swallow, but I needed to be sure. I drove home, my mind racing faster than my truck's engine. I went straight to my workshop, moving past the stacks of lumber and the smell of sawdust that usually calmed me. I pushed aside the heavy toolbox and reached for the rusted chest. My heart hammered against my ribs as I fumbled with the padlock. Inside, the journals looked undisturbed. But as I pulled them out, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. I always placed a tiny, thin shaving of cedar between the pages of my most recent entries, a habit from my days as a precision carpenter to know if something had been shifted. The shavings were gone. I began a frantic page-by-page comparison. I laid Emma's glossy hardback book next to my tattered, spiral-bound notebooks. It was a massacre. In Chapter 4 of her book, she described a, quote, 8 fathers breakdown after a funeral. She used the exact words I wrote about the night I sat in the rain, screaming at the sky until my throat bled. She took my most private, vulnerable moments, the ones I was too ashamed to show anyone, and polished them up for the New York Times bestseller list. She didn't just steal my stories, she stole my grief. She turned my dead son into a plot device to move her readers to tears. I sat on my workbench, surrounded by the tools of a simple man, and felt a wave of nausea. Every time she had hugged me over the last year, every time she had thanked me for the tuition money, she was likely thinking about how much more she could take. I looked at the photos of her graduation on the workshop wall. I had worked 80-hour weeks to put her through that elite school, thinking I was helping her find her own voice. Instead, I had just paid for the education she needed to better steal mine. I wasn't a father to her. I was an untapped gold mine of, quote, 12. The betrayal was so precise, so calculated, that I realized I wasn't dealing with a daughter anymore. I was dealing with a predator. That evening, the house felt like a stage set for a play I didn't want to act in. Martha had invited some of Emma's literary friends over for a celebratory dinner. They were the kind of people who wore expensive glasses and talked about the human condition as if it were a brand of bottled water. I walked into the kitchen, still in my work boots, smelling of sweat and pine. The silence that hit me was deafening. Emma looked at me with a mixture of pity and annoyance, as if a stray dog had just wandered into a high-end gallery. "Dad, could you maybe change into something less industrial?" Emma asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She turned to a man in a turtleneck, a famous critic, and laughed. "You'll have to excuse him. My father belongs to a generation that expresses itself through hammers rather than adjectives. He's the inspiration for the simple laborer archetype in my book, sturdy, reliable, but unfortunately quite limited in his understanding of art." The table erupted in polite, condescending chuckles. I stood there, the weight of the book in my pocket feeling like a lead weight. I looked at Martha, expecting her to defend me, or at least look uncomfortable. Instead, she was nodding along, pouring wine for the critic. "It's true," Martha added. "Jack has a heart of gold, but he's never even finished a classic novel. He prefers his power tools to poetry." I sat down anyway. I watched my daughter spin lies about how she visualized the pain of a grieving father, describing the very scenes she had ripped from my journals while she ate expensive sea bass. She was performing my life for these strangers, treating my reality like a quaint folk tale. When I tried to mention a specific detail about my son Leo, Emma cut me off instantly. "Not now, Dad. We're talking about the metaphorical implications of the prose. It's a bit over your head." I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized she didn't just steal my work. She had convinced herself that I was too insignificant to even own those emotions. That was the moment my sadness turned into a cold, hard diamond of resolve. They wanted a simple man? I was going to give them exactly what they expected. After that dinner, I couldn't sleep. The air in the house felt thick with betrayal. I waited until the early hours of the morning, when the house was finally silent, and walked into the kitchen. I saw Martha's phone sitting on the charger. We had a shared passcode for years, one she hadn't bothered to change. I felt a pang of guilt, but it vanished the moment I opened her messages with Emma. My hands shook as I scrolled through months of conversations. Martha wasn't just a passive observer, she was the accomplice. "Jack is working late at the new site tonight," one message from Martha read. "The key to his workshop is in the kitchen drawer. Make sure you put the journals back exactly how you found them. He's too dull to notice, but let's not take chances." Emma's reply was even worse. "Thanks, Mom. His suffering is pure gold. It's a shame he can't actually write, but don't worry, I'm making him look much more poetic than he actually is. Another 10 chapters, and the sequel is done." They were laughing at me. While I was out breaking my back to pay the mortgage and Emma's remaining student loans, they were treating my private workshop like a grocery store where the items were free. Martha had been my partner for 30 years, or so I thought. Seeing her encourage our daughter to strip mine my trauma for a Pulitzer Prize felt like a second death. They didn't see a husband or a father. They saw a content generator who was too stupid to realize he was being robbed. I put the phone back exactly where it was. I didn't scream, and I didn't confront them. If I confronted them now, they would just call me aggressive or confused and find a better hiding spot. I realized that if they thought I was a simple, uneducated man, I should use that to my advantage. They expected a laborer to use a sledgehammer, but I was going to use a scalpel. I went back to my workshop, sat under the dim yellow light, and looked at my blank notebooks. I started to write again, but this time I wasn't writing for myself. I was writing for them. I began drafting a new quote, 27, one filled with the most explosive, dangerous, and completely fabricated secrets imaginable. If they wanted a sequel, I was going to give them one they would never forget. I spent the next 3 weeks playing the role of a broken man. I moved slower, let my beard grow ragged, and made sure to sigh heavily whenever Martha or Emma were nearby. I wanted them to think my quote 28 was becoming even darker and more desperate. Every night, I locked myself in the workshop and worked on the quote 29. I filled the pages with a sprawling, fictional conspiracy. I wrote about quote 30 I'd supposedly overheard while working on the luxury estates of the town's elite, the very people who funded Emma's literary circles and the critics who gave her 5-star reviews. I invented stories of bribery, hidden affairs, and secret payoffs involving the head of the local arts council and Emma's own publisher. I wrote these entries with the same raw, emotional tone I used for my real grief. Making them look like a 31, I mentioned names, dates, and specifics that I had supposedly witnessed while fixing their mahogany floors or installing their hidden safes. It was all a lie, a carefully constructed web of slander designed to look like the ultimate. To make it even more enticing, I wrote a special entry about Emma herself. I wrote that I knew she was my thoughts and that I was to be her ghostwriter, but that the real about our family's history, something even more scandalous, was hidden in my final secret notebook. I knew how my daughter's mind worked. She was greedy for the next big hit. She didn't want to just be a writer. She wanted to be a revolutionary. I left the new journals in the chest, but this time I didn't lock it properly. I left the padlock hanging open just a fraction of an inch, a silent invitation for a thief. Then, I installed a tiny, motion-activated camera disguised as a dusty smoke detector in the corner of the rafters. The trap was set, and the bait was irresistible. Now, all I had to do was wait for the rat to take the cheese. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with an alert from the hidden camera. I was sitting in my truck at a job site, but I could see everything on the small screen. It was 2 a.m. The workshop door creaked open, and a sliver of light from a flashlight cut through the darkness. It was Emma. She wasn't alone. Martha was standing at the door, acting as a lookout, her face tight with a mix of fear and greed. I watched my daughter head straight for the wooden chest. She didn't even hesitate. When she saw the padlock was loose, her eyes lit up with a terrifying kind of hunger. She began flipping through the trap journals, her phone camera clicking rapidly as she photographed every single page of the fake scandals I had created. She was breathing fast, whispering to herself, "This is it. This is the one that wins the Pulitzer. It's better than the first one." She was so blinded by the prospect of fame that she didn't stop to wonder why her, quote, father had suddenly started documenting the financial crimes of the town's elite. Watching them was like watching strangers. This was the woman I had raised, the child I had tucked in every night, and the wife who had promised to stand by me. They were scavenging through my life like vultures. Emma looked at a page where I had written a particularly nasty, fabricated story about her own publisher's involvement in a tax evasion scheme. She smirked. She wasn't worried about the man who helped her. She was only thinking about how she would look for him. They left as quietly as they came, leaving the workshop exactly as they found it. Over the next month, I watched from the sidelines as Emma became a whirlwind of activity. She stopped mocking me at dinner. She was too busy, quote, 42, quote. She spent hours in her room, likely typing up my lies and adding her own, quote, 43, quote, flourishes. She announced to the world that her sequel, The Concrete Confession, was coming out ahead of schedule. She told the press it was a, quote, 44, that would, quote, 45. I just sat on the porch, sipping my coffee, and watched the monster I had created grow bigger and bolder. I had given her enough rope to hang her career 10 times over, and she was busy tying the knot. The buzz around Emma's new book was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The marketing campaign was everywhere. Billboards featured her looking stern and intellectual, with the tagline, quote, 46, quote. Her publisher was calling it a, quote, 47, quote. Because her first book had been such a hit, the world was ready to believe whatever she wrote. Advanced copies were sent to the very critics and city officials I had written about in my fake journals. Emma was playing a dangerous game, accusing powerful people of horrific corruption, all while hiding behind the shield of, quote, 48, quote. At home, the tension was thick. Martha looked at me with a strange mix of guilt and triumph. She started spending money we didn't have, buying designer clothes and booking a luxury cruise, convinced that Emma's second check would be 10 times the first. They truly believed I was oblivious. They treated me like a ghost in my own house, a piece of furniture that happened to breathe. Emma even had the audacity to ask me for one more story about the elite families I worked for. I just smiled and told her I'd put everything I knew into my notebooks. She didn't realize I was handing her a ticking time bomb. The week before the grand release, the first whispers of trouble started. A few powerful people mentioned in the book began to recognize the, quote, 50 versions of themselves. Rumors of lawsuits began to swirl in the local papers. Emma's publisher was worried, but Emma, fueled by the ego I had fed her, told them to stay the course. She told them her source, her father, was a man who didn't know how to lie. She staked her entire reputation on the authenticity of my fabricated ramblings. I spent those final days quietly. I visited my son Leo's grave and sat there for a long time. I told him I was sorry I had let them use his memory for so long, but that it was almost over. I had already visited a lawyer of my own, not a literary one, but a specialist in intellectual property. I had the video footage of them stealing the journals, and I had the notarized copies of my original writings. I was ready. The stage was set for the grandest book launch the city had ever seen, and I had a front-row ticket to the explosion. Emma thought she was about to become a legend. She was right, but not in the way she expected. The grand ballroom was packed. It was the night of the official launch for the Concrete Confession. Every influential person in the city was there, from the mayor to the literary critics who had helped make Emma a star. Emma stood on the stage, basking in the spotlight, wearing a dress that probably cost more than my first truck. She looked down at the crowd with a triumphant smile, while Martha sat in the front row, beaming like a queen. "This book," Emma told the hushed audience, "is more than a story. It is the truth. It is the voice of the invisible man, the secrets whispered in the hallways of power. Every word is a testament to reality." I walked in through the back doors. I wasn't wearing a suit. I was in my clean work clothes, looking every bit the, quote, 55 they expected. I waited until the Q&A session began. When the microphone came around, I took it. The room went silent. Emma's face paled, but she tried to keep her composure. I said, my voice steady and echoing through the hall. A gasp rippled through the room. Emma laughed nervously. I replied. I pulled a remote from my pocket and pressed a button. The giant projector screen behind her flickered to life. It wasn't her book cover anymore. It was the high-definition footage from my workshop. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Emma and Martha broke into my chest at 2 a.m., photographing the very confessions she had just claimed were her own artistic vision. But the final blow was the second slide. I showed the original notarized pages of the trap journals, dated weeks before her book went to print, alongside a list of every scandalous fact in her book. Next to each one, I had printed the word fiction. Every bribe, every affair, and every crime you exposed in this book was a lie I wrote to see if you were honest enough to check the facts, I told her. You weren't. You were so hungry for a hit that you published slander against the very people sitting in this room. The chaos was instant. Lawyers for the mayor and the city officials were already standing up, their faces red with fury. Emma's publisher looked like he was about to have a heart attack. Emma stood frozen under the hot lights, her intellectual mask shattered. She wasn't a voice of a generation anymore. She was a thief, caught in the act. And she had just handed every powerful person in the city a reason to sue her into oblivion. I walked out of the ballroom without looking back, the sound of the crumbling empire behind me being the sweetest music I had ever heard. The fallout was swifter than a summer storm. Within 48 hours, Emma was dropped by her publisher and hit with 6 different lawsuits for defamation and libel. Because she had publicly claimed the book was, quote, 66, quote, she had no legal leg to stand on. Martha tried to come home, crying about, quote, 67, quote, but I had already changed the locks and put the house on the market. I realized that loyalty is a two-way street, and they had turned my street into a dead end a long time ago. I moved to a small cottage by the coast, 300 miles away from the whispers and the scandal. For the first time in my life, I didn't pick up a hammer to earn a living. I picked up a pen. I published my original journals, the real ones, under my own name. I didn't call it a quote 68. I just called it The Carpenter's Son. It didn't make me a millionaire overnight, but it gave me something Emma could never buy: respect. People didn't love the book because of the scandals. They loved it because it was honest. Emma now works at a small print shop, struggling to pay off the legal settlements that will follow her for the rest of her life. She reached out once, asking for a loan. I didn't reply. I simply sent her a copy of my book with a note that said, "Write your own story this time." I'm 62 now, and my hands are still rough, but my soul is finally quiet. I spend my mornings watching the tide come in, and my afternoons working on a new novel, one where the hero finally gets to keep his heart. Looking back, I wonder if I was too harsh. Some people say a father should protect his child, no matter what. But I believe you can't build a life on a foundation of lies and theft. I gave her the truth, and she chose to turn it into a weapon, so I simply let it backfire. Did I do the right thing by exposing her so publicly, or would you have handled a betrayal like this differently? What would you have done if you found out your own flesh and blood was selling your soul for fame? If you enjoyed this story of calculated justice, make sure to hit the like button and leave a comment with your thoughts. I read every single one of them. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of people standing up for what's right. The end. Thank you for listening.